This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. My guest this week might very well be the smartest person I've ever had on this show. Lucia Mullen is an epidemiologist and a senior analyst at the Johns Hopkins University Center for Health Security. In her role with the World Health Organization, she was part of its coronavirus mass gatherings expert group. That group helped advise some European soccer leagues that are currently up and running, a few even with fans in the stands. Over the last week or so, I've tried through stories I have written to explain why everything is connected in the pandemic, why even if college athletic departments aren't seeing a lot of COVID-19 cases among their athletes right now, the current state of the pandemic for much of the country could foil plans for having a season. Lucia Mullen has helped inform some of the reporting that I've done, so I figured why not have her on here and let everybody else hear what I've been hearing. Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, Apple Podcasts, and just about anywhere you get your podcasts. Please subscribe, and if so inclined, give us a good review. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. And away we go. Lucia Mullen is an epidemiologist and senior analyst at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. She has advised with the World Health Organization as part of the coronavirus mass gatherings expert group. So she has helped advise European soccer leagues how to get up and running during a pandemic. So we're bringing her on. Thank you very much for joining us today. Maybe the smartest person who's ever been on this podcast to talk about college football and how it can get up and running. Thank you very much for joining me today, Lucia.
Thanks so much for having me, Ralph. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, so this discussion, for a little inside baseball to our listeners, is going to replicate an interview I had with Lucia about a week and a half ago where she was trying to explain to me so I could explain to my readers why everything is connected, why the environments which these athletics departments are operating in, the country that they're operating in, influences whether they can play or not. So I'll start with this question. We see these athletic departments testing their athletes, getting relatively, in many cases, not in all, but in many cases, low numbers of positivity, low positivity rates among their tests. We see athletes, college athletes who are not in the high-risk group, generally speaking. And I think there's a tendency for fans to think, oh, we should just plow ahead. Why can't we have this activity? There's so many protocols in place. The athletes are in good shape. I was wondering if you could explain more of why the environment around these athletic departments is as influential as what the athletic departments themselves are doing.
Definitely. And I think the key word you use to reiterate is the interconnectedness of all of this. So the first thing to look at is these athletes that are living in the university life. They cannot live in a bubble by themselves. They're going to be interacting with students, with professors, with members of the community, just going out to get groceries or going to out and about in the community. So they are interacting with other people who may have the virus and spread it to them, and then they can spread it onwards, or vice versa. They may get it from someone else, whether it's within the team, through one of their competitions, and spread it out to the other one. So we have to look at the big picture here, and the issue is how much of a risk of spreading this virus to not just the athletes themselves, but to the rest of the community. And within that, we've got to remember we aren't just going to have young, healthy adults. We're going to have people with underlying health conditions. We're going to have people over the age of 65. And so those high-risk vulnerable people that could go on to or have a much higher chance of going on to severe disease and death. It's also good reiterating as well that we're looking at risk numbers here. So yes, largely speaking, most young, healthy adults are going to, if they contract this virus, have maybe a mild version, be sick for a little bit, and recover. But there are cases that they could go to severe disease, they could die. And so there's still a risk there that we need to look at, the individual risk to the athlete itself.
Are there certain threshold numbers that you look at when you were trying to advise the European soccer leagues? Because there's so much data coming in, and I think to a certain degree we all become amateur statisticians and analysts of the data. We hear about, we should look for this number or that number. But what are the threshold numbers that you look at within the environment, within a community, and again, maybe within a state, maybe even throughout the entire country, that you think, okay, here are some reasonable numbers. Here are some numbers we can use to say we can start getting back to normal. We can start having these sports activated.
So the biggest one we look at, and it's more to tell us, are we trending in the right direction, which means are we controlling the virus and getting lower and lower case numbers, or are we trending in the wrong direction and moving more to kind of an explosion of the virus in a community, is what we refer to as percent positivity of testing. And so we tend to look at this at the larger scale, so either large communities or even countries themselves, on whether we should reopen and go, more and more back to that quote unquote normal life that we're used to. And we want that number to be about 5% or lower. So that means of all the tests you're doing, only 5% should be coming up as positive for COVID. If it starts getting into the higher numbers, the teens, even the 20s, which unfortunately some states in the United States are trending that way, that means that the virus is not controlled. It's most likely at a much higher rate than what we're thinking it is in the communities, and it's spreading quite fast.
What are some of the factors within who's being tested? Because I know this is also, I think that a question that comes up is who is being tested. How many people obviously are being tested. There's been all kinds of talk about, well, if we test less, we will find fewer cases. But you're right. The positivity rates in a lot of states is above 15%, and you're talking about 5%. But do you try to look in a little deeper into the data about what the sample looks like, the data pool, who is being tested? Because maybe if we're using most of our tests on high-risk communities, that could sway that positivity rate?
Certainly, and that's the idea. We want to be able to have widespread testing so we know we're getting a very good idea of what's going on in the community as a whole rather than in small pockets. We also need to have that widespread testing to know where can we do targeted interventions. So if there is a community that has, an explosion of cases, but the next community over doesn't, then we can focus our attention on the vulnerable community and trying to fix that problem before it risks spreading to other communities. And so that's why we do need more testing. Yes, on the baseline, we have heard a lot of this rhetoric that, the reason we have such high numbers is because we're testing a lot of people. But that's not necessarily the case. We have high numbers because we haven't tested enough and controlled this virus from the beginning and done the proper contact tracing to make sure that we're shutting down avenues of further transmission chains in order to control the virus. And that's why it's spread further and further. But using that percent positivity shows us that regardless of the number of tests we've done.
So when we are at that about 5% positivity rate, what can then be done to control the virus? I think that's the word that I hear come up with most doctors and epidemiologists, people who do what you do, is the idea of we have to figure out a way to cohabituate with this virus. We have to figure out a way to live with it. Is 5% the area where we can then live with it?
Yes, for now. I mean, we're getting, very close to finding a vaccine. We've gotten a few good news on that front in the past couple of days of some of the candidates moving to the next stage of the safety and efficacy trials. And so we're getting closer and closer to having a vaccine we can use. And that's something that we'll be able to bring in to hopefully, fully control this virus and not have any circulating around. But as long as there is some circulating in the community, we want to get to that 5% or lower threshold, because that, from some of the lessons learned from other countries and from a lot of the science we're seeing, if we can keep it at that level, we can go more and more back to life as normal, where we can have restaurants open, we can have businesses interacting normally, we can have sports back with stadiums back, and having spectators able to go and watch and not have the risk of every single game or outing causing a further large spread of virus.
Can you describe a success story? You've worked with some of these European football leagues. I believe we had talked about this. I think the highest level German league, I believe, is back with fans. So maybe that's an example. But, whether it's that or another one, can you give an example of a situation where over in Europe, what you would consider a success story, where the virus was brought under control by the community, and also where the sports league itself did some work as far as protocols that you felt were particularly successful?
Certainly. So mentioning Germany, they've been one of the ones at the forefront of kind of leading the pack in reopening, because they were able to get the virus under control quite quickly. And a lot of the football associations stepped up and they've really engaged with all of the leagues and the clubs about performing risk assessments. And then they set it up in kind of a measured step. So the first thing they looked at is, how do we bring our professional athletes back to get them training and stuff, and seeing, are we doing everything we can there so that we can keep those levels low and we're not seeing, a whole bunch of cases pop up all of a sudden because we brought athletes back to stadiums. Once we did that, we then moved on to games, just small games with no spectators, and tested it again. Are we able to have two teams play each other and not have a whole bunch of cases reported in 2 weeks' time because all of these athletes were interacting? And finally, once we passed that threshold, the next one was starting to look at bringing spectators back to games. And a good success story we had, switching continents now, is actually in Australia. We were able to bring, and again, we're looking at very low numbers, first of all, of spectators. But in a stadium, we brought back 2,000 spectators as kind of the first game, and were able to see how well could we employ the various control measures we needed. So making sure that there was no choke points of having all of these spectators coming in to watch the game, and they may be social distancing in their seat, but are they social distancing when they're coming through security and for their ticket checks, and making sure that we had different entrances and exits to the whole stadium, so they all didn't have to go through one entrance or one exit. Having tiered kind of timings for entrances and exits, making sure that at this game we didn't have any food or drinks being sold, so they were really just in their seat the whole time. And from that, we didn't see a rise in cases. And so the next threshold was then, can we bring back a few more spectators and slowly start largening that pool until we can get to kind of 30% capacity, 40% capacity, and so forth. But it has to be done in a very measured way, where you can kind of almost have checks and balances in place to see, is what you're doing successful, or do we need to reassess a little and realign? Do we need to change our mitigation strategies? Do we need to change our messaging, and so forth?
So time definitely is an ally here if you have time. And I find that interesting because, I was talking with an athletic director today, and one of the things, and actually this has come up with several, but one in particular today also brought it up, this idea that he would, and I think they're in the athletic college athletic community, they would like to see how this continues to work, because there are athletes on campuses already, and they're working out, and they're in a far more controlled environment, probably as controlled an environment as they could possibly be. But in the next few weeks, students will start arriving. And I think that there is a lot of curiosity, to say the least, out of how that works. I'm wondering, when you add the element of then school starting, what does that challenge look like? And is it just a matter of, or would you advise, hey, let's let this play out. Let's see what happens when the students come on, and then we can make some decisions? Because that's what it sounds like is going on right now.
Yes, and essentially that would be my advice. The issue is, and once again, connecting back to your first comment about that interconnectedness. Right now, we may have some athletes at the university campuses, but they're there by themselves, so they are almost interacting in their own bubble. Once we bring back those students, not only are you bringing in more people for them to interact with, but we have the possibility of having students from all over the states come to one area. They may bring the virus with them because, as we know, some states have a much higher level of the virus circulating within their communities than others right now. And so from that, we may be seeing a spike in cases. That may also travel over to the athletes that are currently at that campus. And then if we add in the next level, which is doing games and stuff, and you're having them travel to different communities, that's going to bring the next level. So it needs to be tested at each level. And unfortunately, with the way some communities are right now, with the way that the virus is exploding in some communities, the answer would be no, it's probably not safe to have sports go on right now. They need to be postponed. The next answer for communities where maybe it is safe right now, once we bring students back, we're going to have to see, does the community cases shoot up, or are they able to stay fairly controlled? Because that would be the next question of, is it safe at that period in time? We have to keep looking forward because, as we've seen, this virus changes so quickly, or the outbreak changes so quickly, where a community can be doing well for a couple of weeks, and then all of a sudden 2 weeks later, if we haven't had adequate testing and contact tracing in, if our surveillance isn't up to par, we can all of a sudden see an explosion of cases in that community. So there needs to be a lot of monitoring through all of the plans and the ability to adapt dependent on what the situation is at that time.
Sometimes Twitter conversations and Twitter debates don't necessarily meet the threshold of being interesting or intelligent, but there was one that was going on yesterday between some sports writers that I follow and some fans that I thought was interesting. So I wanted to ask you the crux of the question, the core of the question, and that is there is sort of a mindset that the athletes are better off on campus under the supervision, even if it's not 24 hours, and it definitely is not 24-hour supervision. It is not a true bubble, though these athletic departments are trying to create something that has, like, I guess, a bubble-esque in some ways. It has some, bubble-like traits, but it is absolutely not a true bubble. But the idea that the athletes are better off on campus under some supervision from their athletic departments, being tested, having contact tracing and things along those lines, not to mention all the benefits that they get simply from being part of a big athletic program where they're being fed and things along those lines, that they are better off in that situation. And that is a safer situation than if they were not brought back to campus. But part of that also is simply being brought back to campus creates large groups, and the activities they're doing, maybe the groups are being controlled and they're only relatively small groups now, 10, 5, 15, things along those lines. But the simple activity of bringing people together makes a greater threat to spread the virus. So those are the two sides of the debate. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that debate that was going on Twitter that at least caught my eye and I thought had some relevance to this conversation.
So again, it goes back to specific circumstances and the idea as well that all of this, we're not talking in absolutes. We're talking on a spectrum. So, for a student that's in a state that has a lot of high cases right now and possibly in a vulnerable area that is one of the epicenters of the outbreak, going to their university that might be in a different state that is doing much better, for them could be a lower risk, even though you are coming into a large group gathering, which we know traditionally holds a significant risk of spreading the virus. Conversely, if you have the other side of it, a student that's living at home, doesn't have to go out that much, is able to social distance very effectively in their house and is in a community that doesn't have a large number of cases, there would be a significant increase in their risk level going to university, interacting with students that are coming from all over, interacting in large groups again, of getting the virus.
So I want to ask you about Well, a couple more things here on the list, but let's transition to vaccines. You had mentioned the idea that a vaccine, obviously, that's what we're all hoping for eventually, allows us to get the virus completely under control. We will have immunity. We will have widespread vaccine use. And there have been a lot of positive reports that there could even be vaccines in circulation by the end of the year. Now, knowing that, I think it would be naive to think a widely available, to the point where almost anybody can get it, that would be available by the end of the year. That's probably a little too optimistic. Is there a way, though, that a limited availability of the vaccine could help control the virus enough, maybe if we could get it to our healthcare workers, to a high percentage of at-risk people, would that allow enough control to allow us to get back to some normalcy as far as, let's just keep it within the realm of sports, get back to contact sports with large crowds and big teams in big venues?
Again, you'd be talking in numbers. Once we find a vaccine that is safe and effective, and we know can induce immunity against this virus, that's going to be helpful. And there's a lot of discussion on who's going to get it first. And different countries will have different strategies for that. Some may give it to vulnerable populations, as you mentioned. Some may focus first on the essential workers and healthcare workers. A lot of that's going to depend on that higher level decision at the kind of governmental level. But we've also got to look at which countries may get it first or how much they're going to get it first. All of the countries around the world right now are going to be clamoring for that vaccine. We've got more than 165 vaccines in research right now that we're testing, and 4 of them are actually in that final phase 3 of the efficacy test. So this is the kind of last stage before we find out which one is approved or not. But it's a waiting game on trying to get the number of data we need possible. But as you mentioned, it is going to take a while to scale up production and have it in large enough numbers that we can have full normal operating procedures again. And this goes back to that term, if you've heard of it, herd immunity. So normally if we're dealing with an outbreak of a disease that we have a vaccine that can protect against, we need to achieve herd immunity to make sure that those few people that can't get vaccinated or those that haven't gotten vaccinated are also protected, because that means that we've really limited the possibility of this virus being able to spread from person to person. Herd immunity is around 90% and above. That is a large proportion of the population. And so, if we're only vaccinating 1% of our population or even 5% of our population, we're still going to have to employ these other control measures. That's the social distancing, that's the mask wearing, that's the banning of large gatherings, until we can get that percentage higher and higher, that we know that we are able to stop these transmissions of spreading a virus from one person to 2 other people and so forth and so forth.
Okay, and I ask you that question, I probably should frame this for not just for you, but also the listeners. There's been a lot of talk about possibly delaying the football season. Listen, I think you could probably debate whether it should be played at all, but there's a lot of money tied into football. Lucia is a resident of the state of Texas and has a degree from University of Texas and Texas A&M, so she understands that college football is a very, very big deal. But there has been some idea, well, because it's so important to play these games for financial reasons, maybe we could delay them until the spring, not play a normal fall season, but start maybe in February and try to get something of a full season in from there, maybe even with fans in the stands. And I bring up the vaccine because, again, there's been so many positive news reports about how the vaccine is moving forward. If I am trying to run an athletic department and I come to you as an advisor and say, do you think we are moving forward fast enough on vaccines that it would be worth my while to wait until February to try to play my sport? What would you say?
My answer to that would be I think it would be worth your while to wait until February with the hope that regardless of the vaccine or if one is widely available by then, hopefully our other control measures have done enough that we can bring our numbers down and be operating at a lower percentage of cases within the US and circulating within the US, which would still enable you to play despite the fact that we may not have a vaccine. So, if we're looking at other countries and we're learning lessons from them as well, we're seeing that some are able to go to operating as normal, and they've done that without a vaccine. They've done that because they've had very strict physical distancing measures in place. They've done that because they've, really limited the number of gatherings and everything for a concrete period of time, did incredible targeted testing, scaled up their contact tracing capabilities, and they've been able to identify the virus, isolate it, and stop it from spreading. I think all of this together is something that could enable us to be able to operate regardless of whether we have a vaccine at that period of time.
So I think there is a concern among people in college sports, because from what you're saying, and it does make sense. It falls like a logic pattern here. If time is an ally, if having a little more time to do these things sets us up for more success later on, especially considering where we are right now, which is not in a good place, then maybe it would be logical to just kick this down the road. I think that there's a concern. There's a couple of levels of concern. I'm wondering what your level of concern is when you see the current situation. There's a level of concern that even if we have more time, we won't use it wisely. And when I say we, I mean the country, that we won't do the things that you're talking about. And also the other part of that has been this idea that we may end up with a second wave. Now, I'm having a hard time deciding if we're already in a second wave, it seems like the first wave just keeps coming and coming and coming. So God forbid what a second wave looks like. But when you take into account those two things, it sounds like time would be helpful, but would you be confident that we would use the time wisely?
That's a huge concern. And that was, I'm very glad you brought that up, because I was about to caveat that. If we get the time, or if we have time, we need to do something with it. And the worry is we haven't in the previous months, when we have had a little bit of time here and there, in order to scale up that testing, in order to make sure we've got each state having ample number of contract tracers and the capabilities in place. And unfortunately for athletic departments, that's not their call to make. We're relying on the government to start putting in those measures and really prioritizing, enabling states and communities to be able to test, and not only test, but have a quick turnaround time of testing. Another issue we've had recently that's been coming up is that testing times are taking 7 to 11 days. Well, that's pointless. Okay, we can find out that a person was positive, but if they haven't known that they've been positive in that period of time, their infectious period is over, and we don't know if they've self-isolated properly and so forth. So we need to make sure that not only are we testing, but we're also getting the results from those tests rapidly. And yes, if we do get that time, hopefully we'll be doing something with it in order to make sure that we are as prepared as we can in the case that we do have another wave. And really, as you'd mentioned, going off of that, we haven't left our first wave. We've just continued with it. Unfortunately, a lot of other countries right now have been able to do so, and so they're experiencing a lull. But if their cases come back up, we also run the risk of then having further importation of cases while dealing with it circulating with our communities. So it's kind of getting hit on all fronts. So that's why we need to do everything we can right now to control the virus within our borders, so that we can be as prepared as possible and hopefully be able to start focusing more on reopening safely.
Let me ask you about testing and turnaround time, since you brought that up. And I had, Lucia, and you were very nice to look over the NCAA's guidance that was released last week. For the most part, you gave it pretty good marks. That there were no terrible red flags or real missteps in there. There were a few points that you brought out to me. But the idea that right now the NCAA is using a time strategy to release athletes from quarantine or isolation, right? If you are an athlete and you are in close contact with a high risk, or you have a high risk contact, you will be placed in quarantine for 14 days. There are also ways to test your way out of that, but that's not what the NCAA is doing. And part of the reason why is right now they're testing athletes, or the plan is to test athletes once a week. And part of that is because the testing system is somewhat strained. So I would ask you this. It's something of an ethical question. If the testing system is strained, and even if I'm a university, if I'm the University of Texas and I have a medical center and I can work with that medical center to provide tests for my athletes and to maybe get them at a relatively quick pace, is that ethical to do when the testing system, be it within Texas or within the region or within the country, is strained? Is it ethical for sports leagues, and in this case, college sports teams, to sort of jump the line?
It's a hard question to ask because, which test do we need to prioritize? And obviously that first answer would be the hospitals and those that could potentially go to severe or are already at that severe level. And so after that, then it's kind of becoming a free for all. There's so many tests now that are flooding the market. And a big issue with that is the quality of the test as well. We need to make sure that they have high sensitivities. And this is something, in fairness, that NCAA document did say as well, that a high sensitivity means that your false negatives are low. And so the issue with some of these tests that are coming out is the opposite of that. They're getting quite a few false negatives. So people are assuming they're negative because the test said they're negative, but that's not the case. So it's not all of these tests are being run by the same lab. And therefore, then the ethical question may not really come into play, because if you're using your own supply chain, you're not placing a strain on others. But we do need to look at the supply chain as a whole. And we do know that as a whole, we're having procurement issues of getting the right reagents in, of getting the tests in, of being able to run all these tests that are needed to. And so there needs to be a level there of understanding that while athletics in universities is important to the community, and especially, as you mentioned, down in the South, it's part of the way of life, we need to make sure we're not taking away those valuable resources from the vulnerable communities that may need them more.
Lucia, just two more things. One, with those degrees that you received from those two prestigious universities in Texas, did you become a football fan?
This is probably going to send everyone off and decide not to listen to me anymore. Not really.
That's okay. That's okay.
You may not notice from my accent, but I'm English, so I grew up on what you all refer to as soccer. So I never quite got into American football. But I did have a fun time experiencing it. I will give it that.
Excellent. Well, it is a fun experience. And the last one for you is, with your vast experience, and I understand that you haven't necessarily been studying this as much as you maybe have been following this, so maybe it's not a completely fair question. But if I asked you how confident you are that the country, when I say the country, could get things turned around quickly enough that we could have what looks like a somewhat normal football season, at least normal competition. I'm not even going to talk about fans and stands, because that seems a completely different level to try to get to. But do you think there's enough time that we could have a football season that kicks off in the fall?
With the way we're going right now, unfortunately, I don't. I think if some of the states are able to turn around their outbreaks in the next month or two, maybe we could have a slightly delayed season. And as you said, this is not even taking into consideration fans and stands, because I think that's a huge other factor that needs a lot of additional consideration. But I think there's a lot of worry right now of bringing university students back, and with them, obviously, the athletes as well, with the way the virus is circulating in the U.S. Because unfortunately, what we're seeing right now is the U.S. is the epicenter of this pandemic, and we are still growing every day. We have not leveled off. We have not decreased. We're going the opposite direction.
Lucia Mullen is an epidemiologist and senior analyst at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. Lucia, thank you so much for all the information and for being the smartest person that's ever appeared on this podcast.
I'm sure that's not true, but thank you very much.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
And now 3 and out, and a little different 3 and out this time around. Because we had a podcast that didn't have much football in it, and there hasn't been much football to talk about over the last couple of weeks, I felt like I wanted to make sure we addressed at least some things that are a little more football related, though not completely, as you'll see with the questions. So 3 and out will be some Twitter questions that I received from some followers over the last couple of days. So we'll do not just 3, but we'll do 3 and out, and instead of doing 3 and out, we'll go for it on 4th down. So a special edition of 3 and out. 1st down. And the first question comes from Law, Politics, and Football, a frequent commenter to me on my timeline on Twitter. His question, I'm assuming it's a he, but it very well could be a she. So their question is, let's say hypothetically there is no football in the fall, but by spring 2021 we have this thing beat. How realistic is it to think we'll get a spring football season and then a normal 2021 season, just in terms of the wear and tear of compacting all of that football into that time? It's a good question, and I've talked about it with some folks who have varying degrees of worry within the industry. I don't know if and this sounds a little callous, I think I've heard from some people that they don't think that the physical toll of that much football in that much time. Now, take into account, if there is a spring football season, it will not be 12 games. It will almost certainly not be 12 games. There's probably a much better chance it would be something along the lines of 10 games, maybe even less than that. So take into account a shorter spring football season, and you've now had more time for these players to rest up throughout the fall when they normally would have been playing. It's certainly not ideal, and there are certainly people who worry about that much football in a calendar year for younger football players, developing football players. But there's also the thought that if there's only about 8 to 10 games in the spring, there is no spring football. The question is, would you have a normal fall season? Well, no, I don't think it would be normal, but let's define what not normal is or abnormal is. I don't think it would have to be a drastically different 2021. I don't think you'd have another 8 or 10 game season, partially because, listen, if you have to play a spring football season, there's going to be already a lot of revenue lost, right? Regardless of how many games get played this season, this is not going to be a typical football season. There is going to be a lot of lost revenue over this next football, but entire academic calendar season of sports. So now when things get back to normal after the pandemic, let's say hopefully, God willing, by September of 2021, we are back to normal. I don't think there's going to be a lot of desire to then take some revenue out of that season. So if you're eliminating games, you're removing some revenue from the following season. Again, I don't think there's going to be a lot of appetite for that. So when you say an abnormal 2021, what I would think, and I know my friend Stuart Mandel plotted out this when he tackled this subject for The Athletic, and it makes sense to me too. This was along the lines of what I was thinking. Maybe you'd simply delay 2021 a couple of weeks, push back the season a little bit. That might force a 12-game season to turn into an 11-game season. But again, I don't think anybody's looking to cut inventory in home games. But maybe you take out one of the 12 games, make it an 11-game season. You start September 15th as opposed to a Labor Day weekend. I don't think it'll be a normal 2021 season if you had a 2021 spring football season. I don't think the regular 2021 fall season would be normal. But I don't think it would be drastically abnormal. I think it would be more tweaks than a real overhaul to a coming season. 2nd down. And the next question, At what point does Oklahoma's inability to win a semifinal stop people from giving it an automatic CFP bid? And that comes from Bill Zimmerman on Twitter. So, all right, a little bit of hyperbole there. I don't think Oklahoma gets an automatic bid, but there's no question Oklahoma has received the benefit of the doubt in a couple of cases, or at least one case in particular, where it was Oklahoma or Ohio State a couple of years ago with Kyler Murray. I actually thought Ohio State was the better team that year, even though Ohio State probably had a few more regular season struggles. Blowout loss to Purdue, nearly lost to Maryland. But I thought that Ohio State was just a better and more talented team. Oklahoma got the benefit of the doubt then, and Oklahoma's made the playoff almost every year other than a couple. I think last year would have been an interesting test case if it would have been Oklahoma against Utah or Oklahoma against a one-loss Oregon team. But again, the way the chips fell, it was pretty obvious Oklahoma was going to get that bid. Technically speaking, it shouldn't matter. Past performance in the playoffs shouldn't matter, right? We're only judging the teams on what they are on the field in a particular year. That said, human beings make these decisions. So you do wonder if it's a close call, the fact that Oklahoma has never won a semifinal game, been competitive, really competitive in one, not competitive at all last year, and, not that great in the other two, right? Alabama a couple of years back with Kyler Murray jumped out to a big lead over Oklahoma. Murray brought Oklahoma back, but they weren't super competitive in that game. And the first time Oklahoma made the playoff, Clemson handled Oklahoma. I hate to say easily, but handily. How about that? So, and of course, one great game Oklahoma played against Georgia, where it very well could have won. Game went into overtime. Again, that shouldn't matter, but human beings do make these decisions. So you do wonder if you have a close call with Oklahoma, be it this season or coming seasons. But let's say this season, if there's a close call and you're weighing between the two, I think in some ways that may have worked against Oklahoma last year. Had Utah won that game against Oregon and put Oklahoma into that situation where, okay, now we have a tough decision to make here. Do we take Oklahoma or do we give Utah a chance? We've seen what Oklahoma does. I'm not saying it's fair, but I'm saying human beings make these decisions. The selection committee is just a group of 13 human beings. And I wouldn't be shocked if somewhere in the back of the minds of the selection committee, they look at Oklahoma's resume and they have to make a very tough call between Oklahoma or another team, and they simply decide, you know what, we'll go with this other team. Maybe they're not weighing in Oklahoma's semifinal losses overtly, but maybe somewhere subconsciously, the fact that Oklahoma hasn't won a playoff game ends up somewhere in their thinking. Third down. Next question is Miami, Florida State, TCU, Nebraska, and Northwestern all finished with losing records in 2019. Who has the best chance to getting a winning record in 2020? The least chance. That comes from Steve Wyndham on Twitter. This question made me sad because it is the type of question that normally in a regular off season without a pandemic, this is exactly the type of stuff that we'd be talking about. And I would have spent, 25 minutes with a guest talking about a question like this, going over surprise teams, bounce back teams, things along those lines. So this question makes me a little sad, because we're not having more of those conversations. We're having more conversations about whether the season will be played with epidemiologists. That said, let's try to dive into this question. So now what makes it also very, very tough is these schedules are being altered, right? If there were no alterations of schedules, I might have said Northwestern. Northwestern has had no non-conference games against Power 5 teams. So they've had a pretty good chance of going 3-0 in the non-conference, get to 4-5 within the conference. There's a 7-5 record. That's pretty good. Some of these other teams, Florida State's got a particularly tricky schedule. Again, whether that schedule gets played or not is not looking great, but West Virginia, in Atlanta, a road game at Boise State. Miami has some tricky non-conference games or had some tricky non-conference games. It's a good chance a lot of those won't get played. The other thing that's not going to get played is those easy wins, right? Miami's probably not going to play Wagner this year. Nebraska is unlikely to play South Dakota State, though South Dakota State is a pretty good FCS team. But nonetheless, that's a team that Nebraska should have won. Nebraska was in a position where, again, no non-conference games against Power 5 teams, even though a good Cincinnati team on there, a MAC champion Central Michigan. But those are games that Nebraska would have been favored in going into the season. You can get those 3 wins. You try to build off that in the Big Ten. So with that said, Miami, Florida State, TCU, Nebraska, Northwestern. I kind of have to make this call based on which team I think is just best situated by nature of its roster to have a bounce back. Maybe it's because I tend to believe that Gary Patterson teams are at their most dangerous when they are overlooked. He's got a track record of doing this a little bit in the Big 12, having these teams that come off of a bad year but then snap back to it and have a good year. Last year's team was really beset by injuries. Last year's team also had really, really bad quarterback issues. Max Duggan, I think, could maybe fix some of those as a sophomore. Not to mention last year's TCU team lost a ton of close games, and I think that to a certain degree it was a pretty good team that had some unfortunate luck. Now, the same could be said for Miami, so I'll focus on those 2 teams, Miami or TCU. Miami, Florida State, TCU, Nebraska, Northwestern. Just to reiterate the question, all finished with losing records last year. Who has the best chance of getting to a winning record this year? I think it's between Miami and TCU. I think they have probably the best full rosters of those 2 teams as far as like fewest glaring holes. Miami has new quarterback De'Ara King to hopefully breathe some life into that offense. So if I have to pick one, I'll go TCU. If I have to pick 2, I'll go with TCU and Miami. And who has the least chance of bouncing back? Now, let me also just say this. Northwestern, I think, has a pretty good chance of being a bounce-back candidate, too. Their offense was historically bad. Peyton Ramsey will come in. The transfer from Indiana should probably improve that a lot. And the Northwestern defense was pretty good last year, and most of that is back. So they should have a pretty good defense, and their offense can't be any worse. I say the least chance of breaking 500, and again, taking into account, it's hard to figure out what these schedules are going to look like, but I think it's probably Nebraska, and that's a bad sign, obviously. Now, again, my guess is all of these teams will be better this year than they were last year. Miami, Florida State, TCU, Nebraska, Northwestern. I think all of them will be better this year than last year. But if you're saying I have to pick one with the least chance of breaking 500, I think it's going to be Nebraska. Penn State and Ohio State are the cross-conference rivals as we know it right now. The Big Ten West is much improved, so none of the Big Ten West games are pushovers. Even Illinois seems like they're making some progress. So I think based on schedule, based on not having seen a lot of good signs out of that Nebraska defense, based on the fact that their quarterback and their offense needs a big bounce back, and again, just simply staying healthy at quarterback should help that. I think all of these teams have a chance to improve. I think TCU has the best chance of being over 500 in 2020 if it's played, and I think Nebraska has the worst chance of being over 500 in 2020. And let's go for it on 4th down. We'll take one more question. Who is the first coach to get fired this season? That comes from Tom McNamara. So, interesting question, and I'm not going to answer that question because I really don't know. I'm going to answer a bigger question tied to that question, which is how many coaches will we have fired? Or do you think this will be an active firing season? So sorry, Tom, I've sort of taken your question and turned it into a question I would rather answer, but I think it's more the relevant question. And I think we're going to see a very slow down hiring and firing cycle with budgets crunched across college sports, buyouts high in a lot of places. My friend Andy Staples wrote a little bit about this earlier in the offseason, how maybe some schools that want to make moves on coaches might look into how can we assess these contracts to make those moves without paying these big buyouts. By the way, that's becoming a little bit more of a trend in college sports. I think some athletic departments, especially when there's a new AD, come in, make a move, look at the contract, and try to figure out, hey, I wasn't the one who gave this person this massive buyout. Is there a way I can work my way around it? Maybe it has to do with possible NCAA violations that sort of blew up on Kansas, right? Kansas tried to use that approach with David Beatty. Did not work. That said, during a pandemic, with all the budgets being crunched across college sports, with money tight, I think the inclination will be, if I do not have to really fire this guy, if it's not a disastrous situation in my college football program, I am going to ride this out one more year. As opposed, because no matter who you fire, there's going to be some level of buyout there. And if you are truly slashing tens of millions of dollars off your budget, if you're trying to, fill holes that are millions and millions of dollars on your budget, it's going to be very hard to open up another hole. It might even be hard to find your booster that you normally would write that check. Maybe that booster is having a rough year in the stock market, or maybe that booster's business isn't doing as well as it normally would have to write that check to take care of that buyout. So I don't know who the first coach will be fired is, but I do know that I would anticipate a lot fewer firings this year than we've had in recent years, because the buyouts are going to be too steep. People looking for people to write those checks is going to be a little harder to come by. And I think in the past, where we have landed with college football is, if in doubt, fire. I think this year it will be more, if in doubt, ride it out. Hope you guys enjoyed that. That was kind of fun, a little different for me to sort of wing it like that by myself. But you know what? I think I might make that a more routine part of the podcast. A 3-and-out listener, or in this case, Twitter follower, questions. But that's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Warren Levinson, for making me sound good, as always. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts and Westwood One Podcasts. Please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening, and come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.